As an extension to their main Alaska tour, Wings also offer a few days of Arctic birding at the northern outpost of Barrow, now more usually known by its traditional name, Utqiagvik. The only way to get there is a 2-hour flight from Anchorage, north over the mainland, and across the Arctic Circle to the shore of the Chukchi Sea. It had been a very late spring here, and winter's icy grip had only begun to relent a few days before our arrival, although the thaw can be rapid under 24 hours of daylight. The ramshackle town is the northernmost community in the United States, and it's home to around 4,000 residents. As such, it's the hub for the entire north slope of Alaska. Despite this, it can't escape the harsh realities of its remoteness and its long, freezing winters. The homes are functional, cozy inside, but often dilapidated outside. Cars, trucks, and all-terrain vehicles are abandoned when they're no longer usable, simply because it would be too expensive to do anything else with them. The whole feel and atmosphere of the place can therefore best be described as unique. For birders, it offers access to unrivaled Arctic birding terrain, and even the odd comfortable viewpoint. Our base was the King Ida Inn, conveniently close to one of the town's birding locations, the local cemetery. As at Nome, Lapland buntings were commonplace and obviously had nest sites nearby. However, they were outnumbered by snow buntings, which seemed to be everywhere around the town. The males arrive here as early as mid-April, risking lack of food to commandeer the best nest sites. It's been shown that females are less able to regulate their body temperatures than males, so arrive later once the males have established nest sites. The boggy terrain at the cemetery was attractive to semi-palmated sandpipers. Views were clear enough to see the distinctive palmations between the toes. On most, the legs and feet were typically black. However, on this individual, they were distinctly yellowish-brown, Like the sandpipers, redneck phalaropes would prove to be ubiquitous on marshy pools over the next few days. This is a female, and like most of the phalaropes here, it allowed ridiculously close views. There was also a male grey phalarope here, not quite living up to its alternative American name of red phalarope. And a pair of greater white-fronted geese. Up here, they are one of the western forms. Behind the cemetery was a large lagoon, still mostly frozen. On the shoreline were a resting pair of long-tailed ducks. Our first excursion out of town was south along Freshwater Lake Road. Over the tundra were two new skua species for the trip. Of course, here they are known as jaegers. First was this paddle-tailed Pomerine skua. Followed by a pointed-tailed Arctic skua, or parasitic jaeger. We were soon introduced to the local pectoral sandpipers, probably the most abundant and certainly the most conspicuous of the waders found here. Their calls became a regular backdrop to walks across the tundra. Also American golden plovers, the males looking particularly smart in breeding plumage, and the females looking a little more subdued. Having seen the male earlier at the cemetery, it was good to see a female grey phalarope here. Their brighter plumage justifying red phalarope as a more appropriate name, at least in breeding plumage. And of course more red-necked phalaropes. Unlike the female seen at the cemetery, this feeding male was obviously browner above, with red on the head restricted to the neck sides only, and not extending onto the breast. Amongst the long-tailed ducks, a lone male showed particularly well. And there were plenty more greater white-fronted geese. A pair of Stella's eiders flushed from a roadside pool, but thankfully they landed reasonably close. Being high Arctic breeders and in global decline, They are one of the area's star birds. The light didn't do justice to the colours of the male, although it didn't seem to be in full breeding plumage. Females are dark reddish-brown, but a little paler on the head, and look rather more scoter-like than a typical eider. Over on the other side of the town, we visited the famous Whalebone Arch and its nearby assembly of whale jawbones. Behind here are a series of lagoons. Scanning across them revealed a couple of notable waders. Firstly, feeding with semi-palmated sandpipers, was a vagrant red-necked stint. This Asian species has become almost annual here in recent years, and it's suspected that there may even be a small breeding population. When seen well, the rusty tones to the face, throat and upper breast are distinctive. And also a bared sandpiper, seen here alongside a bathing semi-palmated sandpiper. Slightly larger than the latter, with longer wings extending beyond the tail, and more checkered patterning on the upper parts. After a while, it flew into feed, reasonably close to our roadside vantage point. We then drove northeast along the road towards Point Barrow. We couldn't reach the point due to road conditions and local regulations, so had to be content with scanning from the base of the point. There was certainly plenty of sea ice, but unfortunately no polar bears. It didn't help that this had been a poor year so far for sightings. Instead, we consoled ourselves with our first snowy owl, although it was a little distant. Thankfully, another male found just before midnight at the cemetery proved to be much more cooperative. Having stayed up for the midnight sun, it was a relatively late start the next morning, and we drove slowly along Cake Heater Road in the direction of the local oil and gas wells. And where snow buntings waited patiently for seeds to be blown onto snow piles. We soon pulled over to watch a pair of tundra swans. And then another pair on a pool. Formerly called whistling swan, these are the North American form of the species known as Buick swan across its Eurasian range. And unlike that subspecies, the yellow on the bill is restricted to the base. There were also a pair of Pacific divers here. And a pair of grey or red phalaropes. Although the male quickly disappeared, The female stayed around. As with all phalaropes, it's the more brightly plumaged females that compete for mates, leaving the duller males to look after all the parental duties once eggs have been laid. Of course, it's the same story with the daintier red-necked phalarope. Here on their breeding territories, they seem quite at home. However, they are in essence one of the world's smallest seabirds, spending 9 months of the year far out to sea in areas such as the Humboldt Current off Peru. American golden plovers have a more typical wader lifestyle. Despite appearing to be a pair, these were both males. They are true long-distance migrants, and these two may well be spending the winter months as far south as the pampas of Argentina. Pectoral sandpipers seem to be everywhere. Their name relates to the dense breast streaking obvious on breeding plumaged males. This becomes even more apparent as they inflate throat sacs, usually in response to other males calling nearby. Females were much less obtrusive, and soon pursued by males as soon as they put in an appearance. Semi-palmated sandpipers were here, but in smaller numbers. And there were also dunlin. The subspecies here is larger, brighter and longer billed than those we're accustomed to in Europe. Multiple skuas present included this passing Arctic skua. And this incoming Pomerine skua. A particularly extensive breast band suggested that this was a female. That seemed to be borne out when it approached a nest site and began incubating. Its mate, showing a reduced breast band as males often do, was taking guard nearby. Another male was seen tucking into the remains of a dead eider. From what could be seen, the eider was either a male common or even spectacled. Thankfully, a pair of Stella's eiders were much more alive. They were wary and possibly had a nest nearby. But the male at least eventually showed well. A pair of king eiders proved to be our first decent views of another of the area's special eiders. The male eventually allowed a reasonably close approach as he rested by a pool. Swiftly followed by Utqiagvik's true star eider, a pair of spectacled eiders. As with the Stellas, they seemed wary, so we decided to keep to a reasonable distance. When the eiders had been resting on a small island, they had been joined by one of the local black brants. Intriguingly though, and similar to others we had seen in the area, the underparts were faded, creating an obvious contrast between the neck and the underparts. Plus the white neck collar did not meet at the rear. Most likely this was a second year immature. The large gulls here were typically glaucous. Many were heading out to an ice-free lake, where, very distantly, a slaty-backed gull was just about visible in the haze. Our final morning with the group was rather hampered by fog. There were few new birds to be seen, but they included a flock of migrating snow geese. Back in town, one of the local residents had established a set of feeders, attractive of course to the many snow buntings and Lapland buntings, but also a few Coues Arctic redpolls, including these males. Although the tour group returned to Anchorage, Barbara and I stayed on for another couple of nights, based at the appropriately named Top of the World Hotel. We decided against joining in with the annual whale festival, but thanks to our hire car, were able to explore on our own. At Bowerville, north of the town, we even found an exclusive outdoor seating arrangement. Before setting out along the dirt roads, we checked out the lagoons near the base of Point Barrow, and rather surprisingly found a breeding plumaged black guillemot. In fact, there were a pair. Black guillemots have a circumpolar range, but with only a few isolated colonies in Alaska. Long-tailed ducks seem to be particularly fond of these lagoons. Unlike most ducks, they are almost constantly in a state of molt during the breeding season. It's therefore hard to tell on this male whether the white feathers on the nape and the pale pink band on the bill relate to its molt out of or into its winter attire. Most of the pools close to town were by now ice-free, attractive to small flocks of northern pintail. And this Pacific diver right by the road. It seemed to have found itself in shallower water than expected, but eventually seemed okay. we drove out along the Keikita Road once more. Being on our own, we were able to get closer to the glaucous gulls. They congregated out near the town's refuse tip, where close views showed many to have darker eyes and black-tipped bills, indicative of immaturity. The adults looked much more pristine. Some black on the bill tip of the otherwise adult-looking individual on the left suggests it's not fully mature, although these two did appear to be a pair. Gaswell Road extends beyond Keikita Road. A scan beyond the pylons revealed a white blob sitting on a small ridge. It was a male snowy owl. Using the pylons as cover, we managed to get much closer. We had double-figure sightings of snowy owls over the few days here. However, only one of these was of a female. It eventually took flight, pursued by a posse of Lapland buntings. It perched on another mound, but this time seemed more cautious of our presence. Once it became more settled, we let it be and explored the adjacent pools. As expected, there was an abundance of pectoral sandpipers on view. I doubt there's a better place to watch these hardy waders going about their daily business. They are probably the commonest Nearctic wader encountered as a vagrant in Europe. However, most are autumn juveniles. So it was a delight to be treated to so many confiding adults. Away from the deeper waters of the salt lagoons, the long-tailed ducks were more obviously paired up. Females lap the elongated tail feathers and are generally more cryptically plumaged. This male seemed to be in as complete breeding plumage as you can get, with an all-dark bill and no white markings on the back of the head. They nest on islands and peninsulas, and only the female ever visits the nest site. The area beyond the town's landfill site is renowned as a staging site for eiders, and was where we'd seen them a couple of days earlier. Despite first appearances, they were still here, particularly the king eiders, which were more vocal today, Many were paired and presumably ready to move on to nesting sites. The beautifully plumaged males are one of the most ornate of all sea ducks. They will be here on the breeding grounds for just a few weeks, as they take no part in raising their broods, the females being solely responsible for all nesting, incubation and parenting duties. What was presumed to be the same pair of spectacled eiders we'd seen previously were also still present. As with the king eiders, the males are only here for a few weeks and spend the rest of the year out at sea. Around the pools favoured by the eiders, grey phalaropes were remarkably approachable. They seem quite at home feeding on the pools. However, as with the male eiders, females such as this one spend 11 months of the year at sea. Indeed, these are the most pelagic of the 3 phalarope species. And also a female red-necked phalarope. And a foraging semi-palmated sandpiper. Their food source on these breeding grounds has been shown to be predominantly chironomid or other fly larvae. Greater white-fronted geese were the most numerous goose species. Many were in pairs, but others remained in loose flocks. The markings on the breast led rise to the American name of specklebelly. The North American form shares the pink bill of the Eurasian subspecies, but is larger and generally darker. Nearby, a boardwalk led to a research hut, where a pair of grey phalaropes were typically obliging. They provided a good opportunity to compare the brighter female on the left with the male on the right. The males are a significantly toned-down version of the female when in breeding plumage, enabling them to better match their environment when it comes to nesting and caring for their young. The final cold and misty morning at Utqiagvik was spent along the freshwater lake road. Our last chance to enjoy the company of the confiding grey phalaropes. And of course the pectoral sandpipers. I never managed to film the males displaying, so had to be content with a frame grab and accompanying audio. A female was seemingly not distracted as another male displayed overhead. Also American golden plover. This individual was identified as a female due to the pale patches on the face and some whitish banding along the top of the flanks. Semi-palmated sandpipers, and dunlin. A couple of new wader species for this part of the trip included this western sandpiper. In breeding plumage, the arrowhead markings reaching along the flanks are unique compared with other small Arctic waders. The other new species was this extremely cooperative long-billed dowitcher. They have a rapid, almost sewing machine-like feeding action. Females have longer bills than males, but the difference is hard to determine on lone individuals. In breeding plumage, they are less likely to be confused with short-billed dowitcher, that species being less richly coloured, especially on the underparts, while they are also more spotted than barred. At the end of the track, the lake itself remained frozen. This was in contrast somewhat with the surrounding pools, where shallow water was attracting a variety of waterbirds, including more pairs of long-tailed ducks. Note the difference in the head and the scapulars on this male compared to this individual, where the white face patch is much more extensive and long scapulars arching over the back show clear remnants of winter plumage. This is the first male again, resting on the pool margins. And close by was its female partner. Although we'd seen Stella's eiders along Cake Eater Road, The pair on the pools here were much more accessible. By now the mist had cleared and the light made for some fabulous views. If they weren't actually nesting yet, they had probably established a territory here, as they seemed keen to remain around a couple of marshy pools. They would often wander off, but never move too far away. They are the smallest of the eider species, and in many ways are the least eider-like, often seemingly more akin to a dabbling duck than a diving duck. Males are unmistakable in breeding plumage, with a distinctive greenish tuft on the rear of the head, black around the eye and a spot on the breast, and with cinnamon buff underparts becoming richer on the belly. This part of Alaska is the primary breeding area for the entire North American continent. Females are structurally similar to the males, even sporting a similar shaped tuft on the rear of the head. In the same area were a pair of greater white-fronted geese. And a pair of nesting black brants. These looked more typical as opposed to the immature filmed previously, showing minimal contrast between the neck and the underparts, and a thicker white neckband. On the same large pool was one of a pair of Pacific divers, and similarly one of a pair of tundra swans. All the while with a noisy pair of glaucous gulls in attendance. Which were nesting on an island. Male Lapland buntings were vociferously holding territory. And a rather distant male snowy owl was picked up in flight. Thankfully, it eventually landed a little closer. The presence of these owls indicated a reasonable lemming year, borne out by the good numbers of skuas or jaegers also present. This was a mixed colour-morph pair of Pomerine skuas. The dark morph appeared to be the male, as the pale female later approached its nest site. Just south of town, there's an overlook across the sea ice, where a female snow bunting was busily collecting nesting material. whilst the male stood guard nearby. They had been so common here that it seemed strange they would soon become rarities for us once more. For it was time to leave this Arctic wilderness and begin our journey back to Anchorage and then home.